They sat, weeping like little children. It was July 12th, 1844, in Baltimore, Maryland. Joseph A. Stratton, William I. Appleby, and Apostles Lyman White and Heber C. Kimball, and about a dozen other Latter-day Saints had gathered to hold Joseph Smith's National Convention as candidate for President of the United States. After days of hearing and reading rumors, that day's newspaper confirmed their worst fears. A conspiratorial mob had assassinated Joseph. Stratton and Appleby separated themselves from the grieving group and made their way to the beach. They rebaptized each other in the Atlantic Ocean as a sign, quote, before the Lord, of renewed zeal and determination to advance this work, end quote. 300 miles to the north, Franklin D. Richards, who had left Nauvoo with Stratton, experienced the same terrible reality in Rochester, New York. While he recorded no tears, he journaled anger. After electioneering over a month for Joseph, he was enraged to share a boat with 400 celebrating Democrats, cheering their nomination of James K. Polk and jeering the fallen prophet. Richards penned, quote, they might better bemoan their own impending fate and that of our happy country in fulfillment of Joseph's predictions, end quote. Their grief and anger were palpable. But why were these missionaries, now numbering over 600 and in every state of the Union, preaching and politicking in the first place? Why was Joseph Smith even running for president? What would they do now that he was dead? The answer to that question was not then obvious. Yet, campaigning in Joseph Smith's presidential campaign created enduring connections to Theo-Democratic Zion and its current and future leaders, which the shared trauma of his assassination only more firmly forged. Subsequently, these connections led most electioneers into post-martyrdom religious, political, social, and economic networks of power. The revelations and contingent realities that caused Joseph to run for president are too numerous and complex to cover in detail in this paper. In short, his quest to build a Zion society invited conflict with and persecution from fellow citizens. Joseph's responding revelations delineated the role of constitutional rights and liberties, the type of government officers to support, and the need to be proactive in seeking redress and establishing virtuous government. Further revelations in Joseph's last 2 years tied religious and political salvation ever tighter together. Since 1938, he had advocated for aristarchy, or rule by good or excellent men. He further contemplated what he would later call theodemocracy, where, quote, God and the people hold the power to conduct the affairs of men in righteousness for the benefit of all, end quote. In other words, Nauvoo writ large, where a willing population voted their ecclesiastical leaders into public office. Several of the documents in volumes 10 and 11 speak to these ideas coalescing in the prophet's mind. Two suffice to view the development of this aristarchic theodemocracy. In Joseph's discourse of May 1st, 1842, he spoke of certain keys and truths that could only be had in the temple. As with the Relief Society 2 months earlier, he hinted at a royal priesthood of king priests and queen priestesses, which had aristarchy written all over it. A few days later, Joseph began confidentially sharing these truths and keys with trusted associates. Named the Temple Endowment, its participants covenanted to build Zion individually and collectively. On July 15th, 1842, the Times and Seasons printed the article, The Government of God, under Joseph's editorial pen. Quote, it has been the design of Jehovah from the commencement of the world, and is his purpose now, to regulate the affairs of the world in his own time, and take the reins of government into his own hand, end quote. It would be as in the days of the patriarchs and Moses, where, quote, they had God to make their laws, and men chosen by him to administer them in both civil and ecclesiastical affairs, end quote. This theocratic government needed to return, as it, quote, is the only thing that can bring about the restitution of all things spoken of by all the holy prophets since before the world was. As he declared these and other ideas in public and private, he connected heaven and earth, spiritual and temporal, even political. His understandings, intertwined with the pressing need to defend Nauvoo Zion from growing opposition, led Joseph to declare his presidential candidacy and create the Council of 50, the aristocracy of the kingdom of God on earth. Joseph looked to establish theodemocracy either in the United States, preferably with him as president, or in Texas, Oregon, or California. The final 3 months of his life largely centered around his campaign and this kingdom. Beginning at April conference, the apostles called, trained, and dispatched 600 plus electioneer missionaries throughout the nation to preach the gospel and politic. They carried with them a political pamphlet that contained Joseph's policy ideas and also theodemocratic thoughts, such as that under his leadership, quote, the whole nation, like a kingdom of kings and priests, will rise up with righteousness and be respected as wise and worthy on earth and as just and holy for heaven by Jehovah, the author of perfection, end quote. The Council of 50 continued to execute Joseph's campaign until enemies executed him. However, the connections forged between the electioneers, Joseph, and Zion's theodemocracy were stronger than the powder and ball of the Carthage conspiracy. A very high percentage of them transferred these bonds to Brigham Young and the apostles, who had called them and at whose side they had campaigned. From the first weeks following Joseph's assassination to the creation of Deseret and beyond, the apostles made electioneers leaders in organizing, moving, and establishing Zion in the Great Basin. In the available space of this paper, I have chosen the aforementioned Joseph A. Stratton, William I. Appleby, and Franklin D. Richards to represent the historical arc of this cadre of hundreds. Leaders called each one differently, and they all worked with one another and various apostles on and off during their missions. Their post-campaign lives were different in details and length, but followed the same pattern: increased religious responsibility. In Joseph's and now Brigham's theodemocracy, that meant political, social, and economic positions of power. 22-year-old Joseph A. Stratton had just returned to Nauvoo in May of 1844 from a very successful 2-year mission in the East with Elijah F. Sheets. Almost immediately, church leaders assigned them to return back out as electioneers. Furthermore, when the campaign was over, they were to proceed to England and preach there. They would be accompanied by 2 brothers, 23-year-old Franklin and 19-year-old Samuel F. Richards, who previously volunteered to electioneer in Indiana. Brigham Young ordained Stratton and Franklin high priests, a rare move for men so young. The foursome departed from Nauvoo on the 21st of May, 1844, with 3 apostles and dozens of other electioneer missionaries. 1,000 miles to the east, William I. Appleby was becoming one of Joseph's strongest advocates. A former justice of the peace and leading Whig operative in New Jersey, Appleby had jettisoned politics after embracing Zion's message. He had traveled to Nauvoo to meet the prophet, becoming thoroughly convinced. He returned home and became a prolific preacher, leaving dozens of converts throughout the mid-Atlantic states in his wake. While preaching in Pennsylvania on May 5, 1844, he encountered electioneer John Wakefield. They talked the entire day about Joseph's candidacy. Appleby was convinced that injustice and corruption had gripped government. Joseph was the nation's last chance for justice, equal rights, and liberty for all. Wakefield, the other electioneers, and now he, were offering the nation spiritual and political salvation, and, quote, if they rejected either, their sins be upon their own heads, end quote. Appleby enthusiastically mixed his 2 passions that night, religion and politics, lecturing on Joseph's candidacy with Wakefield. He then began blitzing the neighboring states with other electioneers. Until Franklin D. Richards and Joseph A. Stratton separated from the apostles, they heard them speak publicly and privately about the dual nature of their missions. The 2 were struck with the magnitude of what they were doing. On May 27th, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball told Richards new things relating to this peculiar mission. Richards penned, quote, I cannot do justice to the feelings of my heart, but acknowledge the tender mercies of the Lord in casting my lot in company with these brethren of the 12. on my way to perform this important mission, the faithful and acceptable performance of which involves my future prosperity in church life. End quote. Stratton and Richards quickly became close. On June 1st, 1844, overcome with the emotions of their missions, they climbed a high hill together. There, they erected a pillar of stones, quote, as a testimony between us and God that we were willing to do all that He required of us to the best of our knowledge, end quote. Stratton continued east, preaching and politicking with various other electioneers and apostles in Maryland and Delaware. Richards traveled north, eventually reaching Cambria, New York. On June 18th, he gave a wildly successful first political lecture. His newfound fire spread to the electioneers working with him. The next 3 weeks, he was seemingly everywhere in Genesee County, preaching and politicking. He then assisted in the Batavia Conference on July 6th and 7th. He and state campaign president Charles C. Wandell called additional electioneers and did their best to motivate them. The next day, Richards addressed an overflow audience in Batavia's Democratic lecture room, admonishing them to vote for Joseph Smith. That night, he saw a newspaper claiming Joseph was dead. Soon he realized it was true. After a few days, Richards continued preaching, planning to press on to England. Instead, a letter directed him to return to Nauvoo. Back in Maryland, Stratton and Appleby parted ways after their reaffirming rebaptisms. Stratton pressed on, preaching in the area before leaving for England. He served there 10 months as the president of the Liverpool Conference. When he returned to Nauvoo at the beginning of 1846, the apostles again immediately put him to work. Joseph Smith's brother William had sown discord in the large St. Louis branch, fishing for followers to his succession claim. The apostles countered by sending Stratton to preside. He put the branch right, and then in early 1847 led dozens of families to winter quarters. Stratton crossed the plains that year, reaching the Salt Lake Valley in September. He soon was in the bishopric of the Salt Lake 6th Ward and, in the spring of 1849, was elected into the state of Deseret's General Assembly. He and his wife would attend the first Pioneer Day celebration on July 24th, 1849. While the Strattons enjoyed the festivities, William I. Appleby and his family were trudging across the plains. After news of Joseph's death and being rebaptized by Stratton, Appleby had returned home to Delaware, shattered. In time, he concluded that, quote, if they have killed the prophet, they cannot kill Mormonism or the church. And he was determined by the aid of Heaven's King to persevere and sound the gospel drum, and, if possible, with more energy, end quote. His energy produced a 24-page treatise, claiming the Zion Church to be the kingdom Daniel prophesied would replace all earthly realms. He went to Philadelphia, had 2,000 copies printed, and sold each one. While there, Apostle William Smith ordained the 33-year-old Appleby a high priest. Soon after, he became first counselor to, and then president of, the Eastern States Mission. Appleby reported a dream vision where Joseph talked with him face to face, telling him not to go against the apostles. For 3 years in Philadelphia and New York City, he almost single-handedly fought off emissaries of Sidney Rigdon, William Smith, and then James J. Strang, each seeking converts. He was summoned to winter quarters, where he stayed throughout 1848. Appleby and his family arrived in Salt Lake in October of 1849, missing the big July celebration. After the martyrdom, Franklin D. Richards returned to Nauvoo in time for the October conference. The apostles chose 85 high priests to relocate to key congressional districts throughout the nation to build up congregations. Richards was one of the 44 former electioneers to be selected. Despite representing only 15% of available priesthood holders, electioneers filled a stunning 52% of the positions. 23-year-old Richards was also selected as the presiding high priest of New York, ranking others. This appointment was to me an assurance of their confidence in me, he wrote. However, like most of these high priests, Richards never left. Further confrontations with Nauvoo's neighbors changed priorities. Richards evacuated Nauvoo with the church. But at winter quarters, Young called he and his brother to fulfill their earlier commission to England. Richards presided in Scotland and was second in command throughout the United Kingdom. He led a group of converts to the Salt Lake Valley in 1848. In February of 1849, Young selected Richards to join 3 other electioneers as the new apostles, joining a 4th electioneer ordained in 1846. Just 28, Richards also joined the Council of 50 and was elected to Deseret's General Assembly. He and fellow electioneer apostle Lorenzo Snow then planned the first Pioneer Day celebration. These festivities, occurring on July 24, 1849, demonstrated decisively their devotion to theodemocracy. Electioneer Horace Eldridge led the parade, carrying the blue and white kingdom flag, followed by the city's bishops, again mostly electioneers, who held governmental authority in their wards. 24 young men and 24 young women came next, with crowns on their heads, scriptures in the women's hands, and copies of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in the men's. Richard's father gave the oration in which he condemned the United States, declared the Latter-day Saints as the true Americans, likened church president and Deseret governor Brigham Young to a second George Washington, and declared that their theodemocracy would revolutionize the world, all under a 60-foot kingdom flag on a 100-foot liberty pole. Invited Gentile guests questioned the loyalty of the locals. Their charge of traitorous theocracy indeed seemed earned. Joseph Stratton's rising influence in that theodemocracy came to a sudden stop the year following the celebration. Church leaders sent him back to Iowa to assist in bringing a pioneer company to the valley. However, during the trip, Stratton took ill and died a month after returning to Salt Lake. Stratton's obituary mourned that such a young, promising man was taken from them. Death cut short the course he had begun, a course that continued to be experienced by so many of his electioneer peers. Soon after his arrival in Salt Lake, William I. Appleby's connection to Theodemocratic Zion and the Apostles led to important positions. He was elected to the legislature of Utah Territory and served as the clerk of the territory's 2 top courts. In 1852, leaders appointed him the territorial treasurer and commissioned him as the probate judge, an extremely powerful position in territorial Utah, of the new Green River County. He presided again over the Eastern States Mission in 1856. 2 years later, he returned to his previous positions in Utah until dying from illness in 1870. Franklin D. Richards' trajectory lasted the longest and went the highest. In the 20 years from 1849 to 1869, he served thrice as England and Europe's mission president. The rest of the years in Utah, he continued in his theodemocratic positions in the territory's government. In 1859, Brigham Young sent him to settle political difficulties in southern Utah, and a decade later called him to politically protect Ogden from the influence of the Transcontinental Railroad. In typical theodemocratic fashion, Richards was an apostle and president of the Weber Stake, and also served as a territorial counselor and Weber County's powerful probate judge. For the next 2 decades, he successfully defended theodemocracy. In the post-manifesto world, he succeeded his electioneer colleague Lorenzo Snow as president of the Quorum of the 12. He passed away in 1899, having lived long enough to see the federal government crush theodemocratic Zion. As Richards had predicted 50 years earlier, his diligent work in Joseph Smith's presidential campaign had led to prosperity in his church life. Like hundreds of his fellow electioneers, as he preached and politicked for Joseph, the bonds connecting him to the prophet, theodemocracy, and the apostles laboring with him strengthened. The shared trauma of Joseph's assassination finalized the forging of those connections. As Zion moved into the West, Brigham Young and the apostles looked to many of these political missionaries to fill the combined religious, political, aristarchic roles of theodemocracy. They became the foundation of the network of religious, political, social, and economic leaders that connected to and implemented the theo-democratic will of senior church leaders, thus casting the influencing shadow of Joseph Smith's failed campaign forward for half a century. They had been the cadre for the kingdom. Thank you.